Welcome back to Economic Outlook. In my previous set of entries, I discussed several important trends relating to oil depletion. Today I want to continue this analysis by showing how oil producers may evolve over time and give some possible future production estimates. First though, I want to go over the key findings from my first 5 entries to make sure everyone understands the key points which are important for the forthcoming analysis. In my previous entries, I gave the United States as an example of a country which has seen its oil reserves become depleted. The US was the world's leading oil producer for several decades before reaching peak productive capacity in 1970. Prior to reaching peak production, most oil experts denied that the US was anywhere close to its peak capacity, and most expected the bounty of oil to continue for decades to come. There was one scientist named M. King Hubbert who accurately predicted the United States peak production. His models are still applicable today for use in both the United States and looking at oil reserves in other countries and for the globe as a whole. In my previous entries, I introduced a concept called linearization to help approximate the famous Hubbert curve. Linearization is a technique borrowed from population biology, which was popularized by Dr. Kenneth Defay from Princeton University. Linearization plots the first derivative of a logistic function to help approximate annual oil production. The area under the curve represents the total amount of oil in place for a country, or URR. URR stands for Ultimate Recoverable Resource, and this is a term which you'll frequently hear me reference when I discuss making accurate linearization models. The most important concept within linearization is the idea of the logistic peak. Logistic peak production occurs when a country has produced 50% of its total oil in place, or URR. The logistic peak also corresponds to the year in which oil production is at its annual maximum. I was able to demonstrate the applicability of linearization by applying the model to the United States. I was able to show that the United States reached its peak productive capacity near the same time predicted in the linearization model. The decline in U.S. production coincided with rapid global economic expansion. As demand for oil grew in both the United States and abroad, other countries sought to develop their own oil reserves to help meet global demand. Discoveries in the North Sea made the United Kingdom and Norway into important global producers. Other countries like China, Mexico, Venezuela, and Canada each worked to develop their own existing oil reserves. OPEC producers like Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Nigeria invested heavily to help grow their oil output as well. And finally, Russia and Saudi Arabia emerged as the unquestioned leaders in global energy production. My previous entries showed how relative production graphs can help put these changes into perspective. Declines in the United States production allowed a plurality of countries to emerge as important producers for their domestic markets and for export. Some producers, like Kuwait, produced a lower proportion of the world's oil, while other countries like Nigeria increased their share. Russia's dominance reached its peak in the mid-1980s and then declined. These facts demonstrate how several countries have risen to global prominence in oil production. To help meet demand, these countries have invested in more exploration and improved their extraction techniques to bring oil to market. Today, the supply and demand balance for oil rests on a complex global supply chain of oil production, refineries, shipping, and pipelines. This global network of producers is especially important because economic recovery is expected to increase the demand for oil. The ability for producers to meet this increased demand depends on many factors, but one of the most important is each country's level of oil depletion. The United States is a good example of a country which saw increases in production followed by an equally rapid decline in production. If other countries are near similar peaks and declines, the ability to meet global demand comes into question. If supply can't meet demand, oil prices will increase or economic recovery will slow. Understanding oil depletion is critical to evaluating almost any global economic growth scenario. To facilitate this discussion of oil depletion, I will apply Hubbard linearization to several of the world's most important oil producers. This will show which may be nearing their peaks in production and which may still have some room to grow. I will also look at some of the limitations of the linearization model, especially as it relates to countries with discontinuous production histories. I'll conclude by applying the model to global oil production as a whole to try to figure out where production may be headed in the future and whether or not we can meet economic growth forecasts that call for increases in oil supply. I will conclude with a unique look at the world's oil producers, which will help you quickly understand how they relate to one another and what their relative levels of depletion are. Before I begin, I want to provide some information on the sources I've used. All of the data you see comes from either the EIA or the BP Statistical Review of World Energy through 2007. In some cases, I didn't have adequate data prior to 1960. I made some minor extrapolations for countries where it was appropriate, and these extrapolations really have no impact on the URR figures as a whole, but I wanted to include as complete a data set as possible. I used Matthew Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert, to augment my data on the early years of Saudi Arabian production. Data for the Ghawar field comes from an article on the oil drum, and a direct link to this source can be found on my website at www.econoutlook.com. There's also a link directly to a source which helped fill in a few gaps in Venezuela's very early production history. I would also like to thank the oil drum for its informative articles on linearization. I would encourage everyone to go to the oil drum and review the content there because it's some of the best petroleum analysis I've found on the web. The work of Dr. Sam Fouché is also especially good if you're interested in linearization. It was a great help in building my models, and his work inspired a lot of this analysis, and I apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. So I would encourage everyone to go to the oil drum to get a background on this kind of information, and to also get more detailed information from a group of people dedicated to understanding our oil situation. Now that I've reviewed the techniques and sources that I'll use for my analysis, it's time to look at individual countries and then begin the process of conducting linearization, first for individual producers and then for the world as a whole. Thank you for joining me here on Economic Outlook, and I will see you here next time with the individual country results. Thank you.